for the independent expenditures. So there's a lot of, and then one more layer to that is I work on this project for the last, it's been about 13 years now, but it's sort of a big data project under the auspices of the AFL-CIO, which is sort of basically a massive big data understanding at a granular level what's happening, with voters, what's turnout going to look like, what's the implication of differences in voter registration, and certainly in the last 2 months, a lot of work on tracking what was happening with early vote. So anyway, a lot of information to bring to this conversation, and it's a little bit hard to know exactly how to start, but I think I will start with 2016. Because I think you can't really understand what happened in this election without understanding what happened in 2016 and in 2018, because they all lead into this past result. And I will address at some point issues with polling, but I don't want to, that's not my primary purpose here to talk about whether that polling is broken or not. I told someone yesterday, I need 10 more years to get my kids through college, then polling can be broken. So if you look at what happened in 2016, we all thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, including the Republicans, including Donald Trump himself. And, and part of that was because polling suggested that she was going to win. And she certainly did win the popular vote. And the national polls coming into Election Day in 2016 had Hillary Clinton with about a 2 or 3 point percentage lead. And that's basically what happened. Once California's votes were counted, it took a little while. Once all the votes were counted in 2016, the national electoral, a popular vote lead that the polls showed Hillary Clinton ultimately did basically achieve that. But what we know is that she lost because she lost the Electoral College by razor-thin margins in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and those kind of so-called blue wall states. And why did that happen? Because first of all, turnout in 2016 was pretty low. We had historically high. We've now been beaten by 18 and 20, but we had historically high turnout in 2008, and then it was down in 12 and down even more in 16. So turnout was low, and obviously low turnout elections generally do not favor Democrats. Higher turnout elections generally favor Democrats. 2020, I will talk about how that is a bit of an exception. I don't know if the exception will prove the rule, but generally high turnout helps Democrats, lower turnout helps Republicans. That's partly because of what drives turnout. And so historically, people who are better educated are more likely to turn out. People who are more, who are higher income are more likely. People who are religious and high church attenders are more likely. So for all those reasons, older people are more likely than younger. For all those reasons, lower turnout elections tend to favor Republicans, higher Democrats. So 2016 was a lower turnout election, and that hurt Hillary Clinton. We also saw, and this isn't in any way, shape, or form suggesting this is the sole reason or anyone is to blame, but because Obama was not on the ticket, the historic turnout in margins for Obama among voters of color was not true for Hillary Clinton. She did not do as well among African Americans as Obama did. She did not do as well among Hispanic voters as Obama did. The exception was she did better among AAPI voters, and that's a whole other conversation we can have about that voting block. So it wasn't necessarily about share of the electorate. There were some people after 2016 who were saying, oh, it's the fault of blacks in Milwaukee who didn't turn out to vote. Like that's actually not really what happened. Literally, her margins were lower. She was less well liked than Obama. And in particular, some groups, like Hispanic men, for example, are more conservative, right? And so, you can't treat voters of color like a monolith. There are differences among voters of color. The other thing that happened in 2016 was that there was a surge of support among white blue collar voters, in particular in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So you take all, and not just a surge in turnout, but also in voting. Obama did not do well with white blue collar voters, but Trump did even better with them. So you have a convergence of a relatively low turnout election, which isn't that surprising. You've got two of the most unpopular candidates ever. Like both candidates were deeply unpopular. So when you have two very unpopular candidates, one of the things that drives turnout is excitement about a candidate, a movement politician like Obama, right? That drives turnout. You did not have that, sort of enthusiasm. So you had lower turnout. You had, and someone just put in the comment, there were third-party candidates. Absolutely, because both candidates were so disliked. There was, it wasn't as high as Ross Perot's share of third-party vote, but third parties siphoned off support from both candidates, honestly, from both Trump and from Clinton. You have, the Obama effect is gone. So, and Hillary Clinton much less popular than Obama, and you have this surge of white blue collar voters, which produces this electoral college victory for Trump. And I did this project, which was for the Bipartisan Policy Center and Center for American Progress and Brookings, looking at if you were to take what happened in 2016 in terms of turnout among groups, and then their share of voting for Democrats, if that didn't change, Republicans could have electoral college wins until 2036. In other words, if you had the same turnout and the same margins, there's not enough population change that could happen in terms of the diversification of the electorate to actually allow a Democrat to win the electoral college. Now, obviously, Biden won the electoral college, so that is, that was. I'll talk about why that happened. So what happens in 2018? We have a Democratic wave. There's a massive reaction to Trump's election, and you start seeing it in special elections and primaries, where you have people turn out to vote in special elections, at state legislative elections and other congressional elections, and then you start having primaries. Primaries in Texas start in March. Right. Can folks go on mute?
About my work hours, so.
Maybe you guys can mute everyone, and I'll unmute myself.
So.
Did I do that?
He's always getting off of it.
We need folks to get on mute.
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to mute everybody again. Please don't unmute yourself. Okay, Anna, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry. I need to get a T-shirt that says "You're on mute" in the back and say you get off. Please put on mute. It's like I feel like I said that more this year than I've ever said it in my life. So in 2018. You start in 2017, you have the Virginia elections, and Democrats do very, very well in the Virginia elections. And you start seeing primaries in early 2018. You start seeing historic levels of Democratic turnout in primaries. And what's important about it is there are people who voted in 2018 who did not vote in 2016. And that's unusual. To vote in off-year elections, midterms, when you haven't voted in the presidential. So there were new midterm voters, which is, again, very unusual. And then you also had people who had only voting in presidentials historically starting to vote in midterms. And what you see is Democrats win big in Virginia, win back the House in, the House, win governor's mansions, and flip governor's mansions. And that actually continues a bit even into 2019, for example, when we flipped the Kentucky governor's race. By the way, when I say we, I'm a Democratic pollster. So I know this is a nonpartisan organization. I'm not suggesting we like Temple, like I'm just talking me and my firm and the party. I only work for Democrats, and we only work for the Democratic Party. So, so what happened in 2018? Well, initially, I think what we thought was there was a massive increase in Democratic turnout, which, by the way, doesn't usually happen for Democrats in midterms. The last time that happened was 2006, right? There's a massive turnout among Democrats. And this bodes incredibly well for 2020. Well, that's not entirely true. What actually happened was there was certainly 2018 had historically high turnout for a midterm. I think it was in 1909 or 1908 or whatever it was. It was the last time we had such high midterm turnout. I can't remember what it was, but it's incredibly high turnout for a midterm. In some places, it reached presidential level turnout. So, I'm going to shut my door because my kids are using the blender. Hang on. Oh, life in the time of Corona, online school. So what actually happened was there was historically high Democratic turnout, and there was also really high Republican turnout. But so why did Democrats win? Because there was a very big shift among white college-educated women between 2016 and 2018. And so what happened was Democrats won a bunch of suburban congressional districts that historically had been Republican. And so some of those are my clients. So Texas 7, which is Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, that seat had been held, was actually George H.W. Bush's seat and had been held since 1992 by Congressman Culberson. Flipped that seat. Another one I did was Washington 8, which is now Kim Schreier. It was, oh, I'm blanking on his name. I think I saw Congressman Frost on here. He probably remembers his name. He was the sheriff who caught the Green River Killer. But anyway, he decided not to run for re-election, and they had a dream candidate, Dino Rossi, running, and we won that seat. And it was because this group of, mostly suburban, white, college-educated women shifted dramatically. And by the way, they didn't shift back in 2020, right? I mean, that is a real shift. Hillary Clinton lost white college-educated women, not by a lot, but she lost them. Biden won them with 60% of the vote. So that's a permanent shift. Doesn't mean every white college woman in the future is going to be a Democrat, but for the cohort of white college women right now in this electorate, that is like a permanent shift away from the Republican Party. It is also so that and there's some really compelling analysis that shift among white college women almost entirely accounts for Democratic victories in 2018. So you go into 2020, and if you're thinking what happened is Democrats won in 18 because of massive Democratic turnout, disproportionate turnout, then you have to think we're going into 2020 with this historically unpopular president and, layer coronavirus and failure on coronavirus on top of that. And we had massive turnout of Democrats, and we're gonna win. And we had, and certainly the polls, the national polls, which I believe on election day had an average advantage for Biden of 8 points. And the state polls had big margins, the most infamous, it was the Washington Post ABC poll that had Biden winning by 17 points in Wisconsin. And all of this, feels right because of what happened in 2018. On the other hand, of course, Democrats are always like, but remember 16, we got to be careful, but it feels right because of what we saw happen in 2018. But if you recognize that what happened in 2018 was less that there was disproportionate Democratic turnout and more that a certain block of voters became more Democratic, then 2020 potentially is more competitive than the polls would lead you to believe. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that I had all my polls were right. So, we were, as a pollster, I was in the same boat as every other pollster in 2020, just like we were in 2016. But my point is that there were warning signs in 2020 that the win wouldn't be as big. Somebody called it a blue puddle, not a blue wave, which I think is kind of funny, that we had the blue puddle. And so what happened in 2020 was we had massive turnout on both sides. So you actually, when you look at the proportions of different groups in the electorate, there is not a higher share of African-American voters. There's not a higher share of Hispanic. There's not a higher share of white blue collar. They are the same because we had massive turnout on both sides. And what Trump was able to do was find new voters. So the number of votes he got was 10 million more than he got 4 years earlier. Now, also, Biden got 10 million. It's not like Biden also got more than Clinton. But keep in mind, a lot of those new voters voted in 2018 for Democrats. There were more new non-voters for Trump than for Biden. And what do I mean by, and I know I'm getting kind of technical here, but what do I mean by a non-voter? I mean somebody who didn't just turn, there are new voters. The most new voters are people who've turned 18. The vast majority of people who newly register each election cycle are people who've turned 18 and either are automatically registered by motor voter or they want to vote and they go out and register to vote. There are people who are registered who don't vote very often. And there were a lot of people who voted in 2020 who did not vote in 2018 and did not vote in 2016. So they probably voted, the last time they probably voted was for Obama, was in 2008, and they didn't vote. And a lot of them were Trump supporters. And so you could see that actually in some of the preliminary early vote data. So what happened was in the vote by mail, the people who voted the earliest were very Democratic, but the in-person early vote, not the mail early, but the in-person. And there were some states that had, like Florida, have a lot of in-person early vote. What we could see, because we can get updates in real time about who they are through the Secretary of State updating the voter lists, is that they were disproportionately people who had not voted in the previous 2 elections. And so then the question, and so as a result of that, Biden won, okay, but he didn't win by the margin that we thought he was going to win by. And he certainly didn't win in those upper Midwestern states by the margins that were suggested by pre-election polling. But also, because it was much closer, because of these new Republican voters, not only did Democrats lose House seats, we picked up, we didn't win Maine Senate. We didn't win the Iowa Senate. We didn't win, we don't know what's going to happen in Georgia. But, the prediction that Democrats were going to win the Senate did not actually bear out. And why did that happen? Because the congressional seats that Democrats lost were in Republican districts. And so if Republicans came out and new Republicans came out, you're going to feel that disproportionately in Republican districts. So like in Oklahoma 4 or the Utah seat, those are or New Mexico 2, those are Republican districts. So Democrats rented those seats for 2018. They were not necessarily going to ever be permanent Democratic seats once Republicans turned out. And in states like Maine and in Iowa, those are much more rural states than say Colorado or Arizona, where we won. And so again, you're going to get that increase in Republican turnout. It is going to disproportionately help Republicans in these more Republican places, if that makes sense. And so that's how you get a result where Biden wins the Electoral College, but Democrats don't pick up the Senate and lose seats in the House. And all that can happen while basically the votes look pretty similar. If you look at share of the electorate and you look at the exit polls, it all looks fairly similar. It's not that different than 2016, which is sort of nuts when you think about what we've been through over the last year with COVID and the economy and with everything that Trump, which should have helped Democrats, right? But then you have like what Trump did, which was, starting in 2016 to delegitimate the 2016 election, saying he actually won the popular vote. And he won in 16, but he constantly undermined the 2016 results by saying he won the popular vote, which of course he didn't. And he spent then you take Ukraine and everything he's done. People are very focused what he did at the end to try to delegitimate the 2020 election, but he's actually been delegitimating elections since 2016. And so that should have helped him, and he still lost, right? So it's kind of remarkable. And I think what it means is that the next 2 years and 4 years are going to, they're going to feel much better if you're a Democrat and progressive, because we're going to have like real adults informed by science taking on coronavirus, and real adults who have the good of the country at heart and not their own, lining their own pockets, dealing with what we do about the economy. But, I do think the 2022 elections are going to be hard for Democrats. And I think depending on what happens in Georgia, we're going to still see a lot of gridlock. And so, I am personally relieved that Trump is no longer president, because I think that a lot of the damage can be reversed and that we're going to get on a better path. But I also believe that we still have a lot ahead of us because we are a country that is really, really divided. And, what I think we thought was going to happen based on what happened in 2018, which was going to be a progressive wave, turned out, not to be the case. What I'll now say, just as a final point, and I'll stop because I know we're stopping at 1 o'clock and there's lots of questions. Polling, why was polling wrong? Polling was, we don't entirely know yet, because what'll happen is once all the voter lists get updated, we'll be able to look back at our surveys and see who wasn't in there. But we strongly suspect that there are a block of Trump voters who just don't take surveys. And what we don't know, and so that's a partial explanation for why 2016 and 2020 polls were wrong and 2018 were right. They were spot on. So Trump wasn't on the ballot. So the question is, and that's a political issue as much as it is a polling methodology issue, because does Trump continue to have this outsized effect on a bunch of voters that he's able to mobilize them? It's not clear he can do that when he's out of power. It certainly didn't work when he wasn't on the ballot in 2018. So I'm not suggesting that that's absolutely going to be the case. I don't think he's going to go away. But for polling as a profession, like, does it mean in 2022 our polls are right again because Trump is not on the ballot? But that is going to be, I'm sure, a major explanation for why we thought we would do better in 2020, because there were a chunk of Trump voters who simply would not take surveys. And there's some interesting academic research that suggests that people who have lower levels of social trust are less likely to take surveys. And people who are less educated have lower levels of social trust. People who are more authoritarian minded have lower levels of social trust. So it is possible there are a chunk of people who kind of constitutionally are people who won't take surveys. And, that's on us as pollsters to figure out how to make sure we include and accommodate and factor that in when we think about what we think is going to happen in elections. But it's also a political issue as much as it is a methodology issue. So that was a lot. So I'm going to look in the chat for questions, and, feel free to keep adding them, and I'll get through as many as I can before you guys go to your
Anna,
breakout
do you prefer
room.
to do this? Usually we have Sid pose the questions, but if you're more comfortable just answering, yeah, that's fine too.
Well, I just pulled up the chat, and I'm happy to work my way through it. If that might be more efficient, actually, if I just read it.
Okay.
So the first question was, how surprised were you with the fact that although Biden won, down ballot Republicans won? Well, that question was asked like 20 minutes ago, so hopefully it's been answered already. I think that we were, with a couple exceptions of people in my world, we were all pretty surprised. But one thing I will say is that one lesson that I try to impart to people and to journalists is that you should always you should not look at the margin as much as you look at the share, which is to say, there were states and places where Biden or Democrats were up 10 points, let's say, but they were getting less than 50% of the vote. So like, if you go to the Real Clear Politics website and we look at the final polling average in a bunch of states, you'll see that, Biden was up by 8 points, but he was actually at 49 and Trump was at 41, and he got 49. And then Trump got 48 or whatever, right? So like, the share that we found that we actually pretty accurately measured across the board the Democratic share of the vote, but not the Republican share of the vote. So when you focus on the margin, it makes a much more dramatic horse race story. But if your candidate or if Biden is getting less than 50%, you have to ask yourself, like, is he really going to win that by 10 points? And it was funny, there's one journalist who, always writes to pollsters asking for, their take on stuff. And I said to him 2 or 3 times, like, look at Biden's share. Is he getting above 50? And so I looked at all the polls I did in congressional and Senate races this cycle, or my firm did. And I can see pretty consistently that we didn't win any place where our Democrat was under 50% of the vote. I mean, we won some places where we were, we didn't lose all of them, but a lot of them where we were under 50, we didn't win, even if we had a winning margin. So yeah, I think we were surprised, but I do think there's some confirmation bias problems, just like there were in 2016. There were a lot of indicators in 2016 that Democrats would not do as well as we thought, and we all kind of ignored it because it seemed impossible to believe that Trump could win. And I think the same thing is true here, is that there were indicators that this might not be the blowout that polls were saying, but confirmation bias is very powerful, And so we probably shouldn't have been as surprised as we were. Let's see. Isn't polling based on random sample of the possible voters, in which case shouldn't matter if new voters turn out? Okay, so a couple of things. The way we do polling is it is a random sample based off voter lists. So you may or may not know that it is public information if you vote or not. We don't know who you voted for, but we know if you have voted. And so, Secretaries of State compile that information, vendors buy it from the Secretaries of State, and then it gets updated. and it gets updated sometimes in real time. So like when people voted early and their ballot was processed and accepted by the state, that was updated in real time. So in real time, we knew who was voting, starting in about September. I think North Carolina Senate ballot in September. So we pull a representative sample of voters from those voter lists. But you still have to narrow who you talk to. You can't necessarily just talk to every single registered voter, because there are a lot of people who register, say, through motor voter, like automatic voter registrations, who actually are not voters. And so you're always trying to figure out, how do I narrow this down, or how do I predict who I think might vote, so I talk to the right people? Because we know that people over-report their likelihood of voting. In other words, people say they're going to vote and they don't. So you're always trying to minimize that over-reporting. In a high turnout election like this, that can screw you over, because you probably are excluding people who shouldn't be. So that's a delicate dance that we always play. At least in terms of the polls my company did, we erred on the side of inclusivity to try to capture new voters. There's the other issue, which is non-response bias. You can call them or you can email them, but they don't have to respond. So even if those new voters are in my universe, if some group systematically says, I'm not taking your survey, that creates non-response bias, which is what I'm talking about, which is not capturing the full scope of the Trump vote. So even if I pull the most perfect list, to use a beautiful perfect list to be like Trump, of possible voters, if a certain group systematically says, I'm not taking your survey, my polls are biased. And that's likely what happened. Someone asked, are these new Trump voters? They are potentially new Trump voters, but not necessarily new Republicans, right? So they are potentially Republicans who did not vote in 2016, who then voted for Trump in 2020. So they probably, some chunk of them are younger, but the truth is Democrats win that 18 to 24-year-old block, or I guess it would be like 18 to 21 would be the new presidential voters. Democrats win like 65% of them. So it's unlikely that these new Trump voters were young people, just based on what we know from exit polls. And it's much more likely, again, keep in mind, 2016 was a low turnout election for Democrats and Republicans. So there were Republicans who didn't vote in 2016 because it was a low turnout election, and maybe they didn't like Trump very much, or maybe they just didn't care, whatever. But so they were new Trump voters, but probably not new Republicans. So question about the Georgia runoff. I don't have deep thoughts about them. My company is actually polling on the independent expenditure side, but I'm not allowed to see it because there's all kinds of legal rules about what data different people can see in my company. It's a whole other can of worms, have to do with hard side, soft side money and coordination and stuff like that. I will say that I think it's certainly possible we could win both. I think it's more likely we win one. Keep in mind that Democrats have always had a very hard time winning runoffs in the South. And it had to have, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, these post-election runoffs have always been historically hard for Democrats to win. It's really not clear. And it's really hard. It's even harder now to know because there's so many weird things happening with Trump attacking Kemp and the integrity of the election down there, with Trump not on the ballot. Kelly Loeffler is a particularly damaged candidate who's never actually won anything. So there's just so much going on there. It's just really hard to know. Historically, Democrats have not fared well, though, in runoffs. What pollsters are doing to correct the universe for next time? Well, one, we don't know if it's Trump effect. We won't really know until 2022, were the polls wrong because we can't capture that group of Trump people, and if Trump's not on the ballot. That probably partly fixes the problem itself. We did fix after 2016 the education problem, which we didn't have enough white non-college voters in our samples for a variety of reasons, and so that kind of got fixed. I think the other big fix, which is where the voter files will not be fully updated till March or April, so it's going to be a while before we know who actually voted. But there's some indication that we need to fix urbanicity, which is to say, it's not just enough to make sure you have enough white blue collar voters. You have to have enough who live in rural areas. So like if you do a statewide survey and you want to make sure that 60% are white people without a college education, it's not enough just to get them all from the suburbs. They have to also come from the rural areas. So that's a lot of front end sample management, like saying to the calling house that's calling, you have to get X% white blue collar, but they also have to come from these counties. So my guess is that's going to be a fix. Well, there's always polling error, always, always, always. You can't fix all of it. Some of it's just inherent to, what you do, with our sample surveys. We're not doing census. And even the census has problems, right? But that's probably going to be one of the fixes. There's a question about what the impact of the Lincoln Project was. I don't know. It's not clear. It's certainly, if nothing else, it occupied Trump's headspace and Republican headspace in a way that was not helpful to them. I'm not sure it switched a lot of votes, but it sure was fun. And when I say like it didn't switch votes, the biggest shift between 16 and 20 was white non-college women in terms of vote. And also there was significant movement of white college educated men too, which is not as big. Otherwise, votes looked fairly similar between the 4 years in terms of like who voted for Biden versus Trump versus Clinton and Trump. So it's hard to really make the argument that any one individual effort like had a huge, impact. So one of the unfortunate things about not doing better down the ballot is it is a redistricting year. And it does look like, I think in some good news, I think the census will not be completed while Trump is president. So hopefully we'll be able to have a more robust census before, hopefully we'll be able to finish it. Because basically they set a deadline for it to be done, whether it was done or not, which is not how you do the census. So hopefully, if it won't be done before Trump's out of office, we'll be able to have a better census. But it also means there'll be less control for Democrats around redistricting. There were states like Texas where we thought we might win back one of the houses. So we didn't win state legislative races. There's so little ticket splitting that Republican success higher up really affected state legislative races. So we're going to, it's going to be hard. I don't think it's going to be good for Democrats. So for example, Texas will probably pick up 3 seats and Democrats are going to have no role. In other places, it's not universally going to be bad. For instance, in Pennsylvania, which is one of the worst states, we have a Democratic governor. We also have a Democratic Supreme Court. So even though, Democrats lost in the state legislature, they already were, and also the state legislature is highly gerrymandered. So Democrats lost seats in Pennsylvania in the state legislature, but because the 2 other branches, because Pennsylvania has elected Supreme Court, it's nonpartisan, but they're more Democrats. It is highly likely that Pennsylvania will net a seat. Even if Pennsylvania loses, will net seats for Democrats because you'll have a more fair redistricting in Pennsylvania. But on balance, this probably hurts Democrats, both because the census will be imperfect because Trump was in charge of it, even if we can make it better, and because we didn't win state legislative races. We didn't pick up houses in state legislatures. How much will the progressive agenda pose a problem for swing districts in 2022? There is this kind of internal fight right now, which is, I think, really unhelpful between moderates and progressives. Here's what I think is going to happen. Nothing is going to pass the House that can't win some Republican votes in the Senate, so that we can have a fight about whether or not who has power in the party, progressives versus moderates. But in practice, what's going to happen is we're not going to have huge progressive victories in the House. We're not going to have Medicare for all. We're not going to have Green New Deal. We're going to have to rely on Romney and Murkowski and Collins and maybe Burr and Toomey, because those 2 are retiring, though Lamar Alexander was not a profile on courage and he was retiring. So you can never rely on Republicans, or something that McConnell's willing to do. No, even if we win both seats in Georgia, that's still a 50-50 Senate. And yes, Kamala Harris will be the tiebreaker, but I don't know what happens with the filibuster with the 50-50 Senate. If you still need 60 votes, it doesn't matter if it's a 50-50 Senate. So even if we win both those seats, yes, it'll be better, no question, but it's not like it solves the problem. So, so in terms of the incumbents in swing districts, I think for incumbents who got reelected, I think they'll be okay, because mostly the people who won in 2018 and held on in 2020 were in districts that have changed, and they've either changed because because of that shift with white college women becoming more Democratic, the suburban districts, or because they've become, because of growth with the voters of color, or both those things at the same time. Those districts have kind of changed, and I don't think they're just going to swing back. Even if I think we're much more likely to have a hard time holding on to the House in 2022 because of redistricting than places that we won in 18 and 20 kind of going to Republicans. So the question is it possible to factor in the methodology to account for the, I have to change I gotta change my headphones here because they ran out of juice. Hang on one second. I assume you can all still hear me. There are ways to do it. I mean, we do something called weighting. We weight data. What that means is, let's say we know, because we do know some facts, there's some objective truths. We know that 53% of the electorate is female. So if your poll comes in 49% female, you're going to take it and increase the value of women voters so that they comprise 53%. So we do that we adjust surveys all the time. What you could do is you could take Republicans and make them more conservative, right? So you could weight within subgroups and do that. The question is, we don't have any objective information on how to do that. We probably will start doing that, but it's much easier to weight on demographics, like what proportion of the electorate should be African-American, or should be Latino, or should be female, or should be older. We have information on that from the census, from the voter file. When it comes to attitudes, we don't know. So we have to make guesses. So yes, we probably will have to do that, but it's not necessarily easy. There was a question about whether or not defund, why did it stick to Democratic candidates? Again, I go back to this point that overall, the electorate looks pretty similar to 16. So to blame any one thing like defund, I think is kind of hard. It's just as much, I think what mobilized those Trump voters to come out in 2020 when they didn't in 2016, to me, that's immigration, socialism, China, defund. It's all of those things. It didn't have any impact on the housewives, that Trump was trying to with defund and protest and affordable housing in the suburbs. I mean, his goal, which was his stated goal, was try to win suburban housewives, which doesn't exist as a category anyway. But I think for the people he mobilized in his base, it was everything. I just think he, everything mobilized them, and the defund was part of it. So, I'm waiting to see some real evidence that defund was the reason we lost down the ballot. When you look at the vote share, looking fairly similar over the past 4 years in terms of the percentage of people who voted for Biden and Trump not being hugely different than what happened in 2016. So there was a question about, that Biden did worse than Hillary in some blue states, in the cities. Well, there's a couple things, and was there something fishy going on with mail-in ballots? Probably. I mean, we don't know. We don't know how many ballots were not delivered by this post office. We know there were some. We don't know how many, but we know there were. We also know that that minority ballots are disproportionately rejected, and younger people's are disproportionately rejected. Democrats did yeoman's work to cure ballots, as they call it. But even something as simple as the fact that younger people are much less likely to have a consistent signature because they don't have to sign. So older people used to have to sign checks and credit cards and have a consistent signature. Younger people don't have a consistent signature because they never signed anything. And so, and younger people are more likely to vote for Democrats. So there is probably at the margins some piece of of funny business, not so much, signature validation isn't necessarily nefarious, right? It's just that it disproportionately affects certain people. Some of it is nefarious, like sitting on ballot, not delivering. We know the post office was monkeying around with ballots. So that is probably part of it. But it is also true that, there are some groups where Biden did do less well than Clinton. And, I think, within, certain, for example, Hispanic men are pretty pro-police. So, it is possible that we know that Biden did less well with Hispanic voters than Clinton did. We know that not just from exit polls, like I did precinct analysis and diverse precincts, comparing diverse precincts in Texas between 20 and 16, and you can see it. It's possible that happened too. So I think probably both those things are true kind of on the same time. God, wow, there's so many questions. I'm happy to go a little bit longer if you want to delay your breakout. I defer to the moderator on that if you want to delay your breakout, and I'll answer more questions. I just have to be off at 1:30 to take my kids to the dentist.
Anna, it's
yeah.
Nancy, who's the co-chair. So
Yeah.
why don't we go to 1:05 and that'll.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, then let me keep going. I would skip to the bottom because I didn't want people who got questions in late to feel like they had been left out. Does Obama's win in 08 and 12 and Hillary's loss 15 means America is less racist and more sexist? I think we are very racist and very sexist at the same time. I think both those things are true. There was some good work in 2018. In 2016, there was this argument that this kind of is it economic insecurity and that's why Trump won, or is it racism? And then people really focused, and academic research showed pretty decisively that it really wasn't economic anxiety, it was actually racial attitudes, was the stronger predictor of people voting for Trump. And gender kind of got left out, even though hello, it was such a gendered election. In 2018, and so 2018 was a very gendered election. I mean, very gendered election. I mean, everything from the Women's March to the number of women candidates running, to the narrative of what the election was about, women's power, Pelosi. I mean, it was just a very gendered election. And, academics looked at it and saw that, in 2018 and even going back to 16, that in addition to racial attitudes about gender, what they call the hostile sexism scale, which is hostile sexism is when women, get, when people talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, it's really women trying to get special favors, as opposed to benign sexism is opening a door for a woman, or women are special and should be protected. A bit more benign sexism. That hostile sexism was also a predictor of the vote. So I think both racial attitudes, what we call the modern racism scale, and hostile sexism are predictors of vote choice, were and are in 16, 18, and 20, and frankly in elections prior to that. I think what was so jarring and distressing was that Trump normalized racism in a way, and it wasn't like those racial attitudes were new, but he normalized it. And because of social media and because of kind of curated media consumption, brought it into the mainstream in a way that sexism was already there. It's still pretty mainstream to be sexist. It's not as verboten to be sexist. So, I think we are as sexist and racist as we always have been. And, in some ways, I mean, I hate to say this, I think Obama his election was a little bit exceptional. I do think the country is going to change. I mean, it's just going to take a long time. Okay, sorry, that's really depressing. I apologize for that. We should all be happy Trump is not our president anymore. Let's see. So there's a question of, while the country's divided, some voters may be deeply committed to their views. What are the proportions? I think you have to distinguish between attitudes and voting. If you look at the electorate and the populace as a whole and take voting out of this and just look at their attitudes about policy, equality, leaving aside racial equality, economic equality, actually a pretty moderate to progressive country. Like, the vast majority of people want affordable health care for everybody and support a public option. The vast majority support moving to renewable energy, right? Like, you know, this whole idea that like we are polarized around these policy choices is just wrong. Republicans are a minority party with disproportionate electoral power, and it gives the illusion that we are divided on these fundamental issues around healthcare, economy, environment. We're just not. And I think the problem in talking about proportions, like what proportion is progressive and what proportion is conservative, is that there is disproportionate conservative power in electoral politics, which affects policy, but that doesn't mean the country itself is polarized around policy. The country is polarized around race, no question. But even that is not necessarily, we're not necessarily more racist than less racist. Like, it kind of has to look at how you define it. And there's mitigating factors. So in some of the work that I've done on modern racism, party mitigates racism. So if you look, this is complicated, but it's interesting. Like, if you take high, medium, and low racist based on this modern racism scale, which is just a bunch of attitudinal questions, and if you look at Democrats, they are less, the high racism Democrats, and there are very few of them, still overwhelmingly vote for Biden. So party mitigates the effect of racism on vote choice. You know what I mean? So like that kind of question of like what proportion are we, is really hard to answer, because like it has so many different dimensions. I think we are a center/lean progressive in policy terms and core values terms, and we are a center-lean right in electoral outcomes. And that's a very frustrating place for all of us to be. And unfortunately, because there's another question about how can we help Pelosi and Democrats be successful in presumably in the next 2 years in 2022, that is the challenge in that kind of setup. I do think in making sure we keep progressives and Democrats were really engaged in between elections in the last 4 years, which is to say, giving a ton of money. Our Democratic incumbents were so much better funded than Republican incumbents in 2020. That has to be true again in 2022. Like, small dollar donors need to be engaged even though we beat Trump. Trump was such a huge driver of small dollar giving for Democrats. How do we figure out how to have that small dollar giving be sustained for the next 2 years for the midterms? Because we're not going to have Trump as the boogeyman driving that. And that was a huge, huge driver. Similarly, how are we going to make sure that our turnout stays up in 2022 like it was in 18 and in 20? So there's like a whole set of things around how we maintain, and people are tired. We're all tired. I'm tired. We're all tired, So I think a huge part of helping them be successful, all of us who care deeply about this, and I assume you all do because you're on Zoom in December learning about the election or hearing my views, is how do we maintain that level of engagement? Because if 2022 is competitive, it means some Republicans are going to come to the table in the Senate to get stuff done. And if McConnell thinks it's in his interest to get some things done because he wants to keep the Senate, and some of these Republicans, North Carolina will be in play, Georgia will be up again. I mean, Arizona is going to be up again. Mark Kelly's only a 2-year term. He's doing McCain's last 2 years. So, to the extent that 2022 is viewed competitively by Republicans, also, it potentially brings them to the table. So, I don't have an easy answer on how to help them, but I think, that's some of it. There's a question about, is immigration a kind of a winning issue for Democrats, electorally speaking? No, but it's not a losing one either. And that's a change. So, back in 2014, immigration was just killer for Democrats. And, you know, what Republicans kind of tried to use it in 18, it didn't really work in the suburbs. And, you know, Trump was pretty quiet about immigration in 2020. And I don't think that was an accident. I think the fact that he made gains with Hispanic voters is real. We can see it in the data. And he didn't talk about, I mean, just think about it. There wasn't national, I mean, the xenophobia was directed at China over the last year. It was not directed at Hispanics. He dialed way down border stuff. So, you know, it didn't, you know, it didn't necessarily hurt us. But it maybe even, you know, but it didn't necessarily help him. So, you know, I think it's, and I think, you know, that I think Republicans will be a little more generous on DACA and stuff like that for a variety of reasons, not of all of which, by the way, is because they have good values. I think the business community is very happy that Biden won. They want business to go back to normal. They want their H-1B visas. They want their tech workers. Universities want their foreign students. Like, so, you know, I think some of the dialing down immigration is coming out of a bottom line for business who want business as usual. I know that's cynical, but I think it's true. Another question was, how did Trump's approach to the pandemic affect the election? I actually think it really hurt him. And, you know, I think it hurt him because it hurt him, and I think that's a big, like, why he lost, part of the reason why he lost. I mean, part of why he lost was baked in that shift between 16 and 18 among white college women that we talked about. So that helped Democrats in 2020 also, for sure, especially in states like Colorado and Arizona, where we picked up the Senate, and also Biden won Arizona. Those shifts helped him, you know. But I also think independent voters also shifted against Trump. So Trump, I think he broke even with independents in 2016. I can't remember off the top of my head. They definitely lost independent voters, and that hurt him. I mean, Biden's margins were bigger in, you know, than Trump's were in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. I mean, you have to remember, like, Trump's margins were small in those states. I think 70,000 votes had to switch across those three states for Clinton to have won. Biden's were, I mean, he won by a couple 100,000 votes in Michigan. And that's partly because of independent voters. And for independent voters, as long as the economy was doing well, and it seemed like, you know, and they were giving Trump credit for it. And so the fact that the economy tanked because of COVID, it was already slowing down pre-COVID. It wouldn't have been as great as it was. He juiced it with his tax cuts and Fed policy and that kind of thing. Took away one of his main arguments with voters who didn't like him. So there were a lot of independents who didn't like him. And, you know, Democrats have a big problem. I don't think voters think Democrats really, it's ironic because the economy usually does better with Democrats as president, but I think voters don't think Democrats really understand the economy. They don't think Democrats are pro-growth. They think Democrats want to redistribute wealth. They don't care about growth. I think that's a big problem for Democrats. Democrats should be the champion of small businesses. And I don't think voters think they are. They think they're the champions of regulations, which kill small businesses. So my point is that there's a whole bunch of independents who aren't Republicans, right? So they don't like Trump, but they don't necessarily think that, you know, Elizabeth Warren is going to fix the economy. Well, you have, like, the economy collapse. Then you have someone like Biden who feels safe, you know, and the argument that Trump's going to get us out of this hole is kind of gone for him, and that shifted votes away from Trump. So I think the pandemic did hurt him. It just didn't necessarily have, I mean, for it to have had the size of the impact that we did, I mean, his failure, you know, we should have had a blue wave in 2020 as opposed to a blue puddle, right? So definitely the pandemic contributed to the blue puddle, but it should have, in my view, given the abject failure, both malicious failure and incompetence failure on COVID, should, in my view, we should have had a bigger win. Let's see. Is it possible to separate race from class in your analysis, or is understanding the influence of both that is such a good and hard question. And in fact, there's a lot of work being done in kind of the progressive research community around how do you marry race and class, which is to say, there are so many policies, and this goes back to my point about there's a lot of unanimity on the policy level about healthcare and economic equality, that it should be possible to have a cross-racial coalition based on populism. And there's definitely a lot of work being done to try to figure out how do you do that. And I think this is like the fundamental challenge. Like I actually don't have a good answer on this because of the way Republicans have used race as a wedge to try to undermine cross-racial coalition building around economic equality. That has been their strategy since Nixon. If you think of the law and order strategy, that has been their strategy for, this is their playbook. Dog whistle politics is their play. That's exactly what they're trying to do. I don't think the 2020 election changed that dynamic. So it's an excellent question, and in principle, it should be possible, but it hasn't been possible yet. It certainly hasn't been possible. I think Clinton was probably really the last president who was really able to put that kind of coalition together. And there was a lot of controversy. I mean, this is an older crowd and you're very political. So you probably remember the Sister Souljah moment, right? And welfare reform. In some ways, Clinton's success in bringing together people of color with white blue collar was in some ways because he reassured white blue collar on race versus he reassured on economy. So that's a really cynical view of what Clinton did. I don't think we've seen that kind of coalition. I take it back. Obama in 2008 Obama didn't do terribly with white blue collar voters in 2008. We did Democrats, and he had done terribly since then. So he was able to get some white blue collar voters who very quickly turned against him, particularly among seniors. So I don't think Obama's success there is nearly as sort of the same magnitude of what Clinton was able to do. Someone's asked how Bernie would have done in 2020. I think he would have lost. I'm sorry if there's any Bernie supporters. Think about those independent voters who needed some reassurance. They were like, I don't really trust Democrats, and Trump's done a pretty good job on the economy. And I think that if Bernie had been the nominee, I think that some of those independent voters they might have said, Trump did okay before the pandemic, so maybe I trust him more than Bernie to kind of dig us out of this economic hole. I think that Biden ultimately was the right, and I'm not saying right in moral terms, I'm just talking about purely in terms of electoral terms. Biden was probably the right choice for the Democratic Party in the end. I don't know that I would have said that a year ago, pre-pandemic and pre-economic collapse, but I do think people are looking for a lot of reassurance in this current moment we're in that we're going to return to normal, and they aren't necessarily thinking in terms of revolution. It's going to be so hard to even return to what was not so great. I'm not suggesting, I do think Democrats should talk about the new normal should be better than what happened before, for sure. But the notion of overturning the entire system when people just want their unemployment benefits extended, I just think it's been challenging.
Anna,
I think I covered most of the questions.
I think that was it. I think that was the last question. So I think we could have gone on and on and on because it's really an important topic. And we just want to thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Yes, we did have a record turnout today, more than 130 people.
I'll tell Dana.
And friends, so you can brag and you can say, start a competition with your husband. So we really appreciate for sharing your expertise and bringing some clarity regarding what happened, not only in the 2020, but the 2016, 2018. And
Mhm.
really wonderful hearing about the success that you had with Mark Kelly and John Hickenlooper. I think that was great. Kudos to you on a job well done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Though we remain muted, I know that all the participants here today join me in a rousing round of applause.
A muted applause.
You may not be able to hear it, but you, I forgot to start. Sorry, but anyway, I know that you can't hear it, but everyone really is clapping and thanking you for today's presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll see you on Zoom on Shabbat services and hopefully in person in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everybody, and happy Hanukkah.
All right. The same to you.
Thank you.
We're gonna go into our breakout rooms. We're probably not going to be there for as long as we have formally, but I want to let everyone know first about our Lunch and Learn program next time. It's hard to believe we're rounding the corner to 2021 and it can't come soon enough. The first Lunch and Learn program in the new year will be held on Wednesday, January 13th. The speaker will be Temple Micah member Helen Schwartz, and the title of her presentation is Renoir's Three Sisters and Nazi Art Theft. In 1880, Renoir signed a contract to paint the portraits of the three daughters of a wealthy Jewish Belgian banker. These paintings were stolen during World War II. Helen will talk about the fate of the artwork and the siblings. She will also share with us an excerpt from her upcoming historical suspense novel, Thieves of Paris, which introduces the oldest daughter, the Countess Irene. In a few minutes, David Diskin, our very able Zoom master, will place each of us randomly at various breakout tables. I think we're just going to spend about 15 minutes today in those breakout rooms. And then we'll come back and just have some closing. So you're going to have a chance to talk about what we heard today and to chat with old and new friends. You may now unmute your audio, turn on your video. Be sure you're in the gallery view. And if you need any help while in the breakout rooms, you can click on the question mark and David will join your group.
Right next to it, start video.
David will now do his magic and take us away to our tables. David?
Not starting. I don't know.
Hi, Sid.
Sid?
Hold on just a second, everybody.
Yes.
Okay, join your breakout rooms.
Hi, Laura. I just didn't see you this morning. That's good. There were a lot of people on this call. I think you're muted. You can hear me, but I couldn't hear you.
Yeah,
I
we're all
hear you
back.
now. I hear
That's
you.
better.
I heard.
So now we can see who we didn't even see before. Okay.
How many people were on this call? You said it was a
I
record.
think it looked like about 97 connections at one point.
But that was just screens. Think of all.
Yeah, that was screens. Yeah, that was
I
I
connections.
saw 99 at one point.
Okay, maybe 90. Just
That doesn't count the telephone people. That only counts the video.
No, it counts,
No, it was
No, it counts
everybody.
everybody.
but it doesn't count when two people on the
Right,
same
like when there are two of
system.
us.
So there's
Right.
probably
Okay, you get it
No.
all mixed up.
a good percentage more. We have a lot of couples. When we tried following it once. And,
David,
David, some of us can't get our video on it. It says.
thank you, Helen. That's what I was
Yes,
going to
yes.
say.
Okay, I'll tell you, as I explained,
All right.
you should have asked me because I helped a couple other rooms.
Okay.
This is what happened. So I had to make a real-time decision. Normally, so we asked a couple times for everybody to stop their video. But of course, a lot of people don't do it.
Well,
And
Well, we
just
didn't
a minute.
know how to do it.
You didn't know how to do it.
We'll have
Okay.
to get lessons, I think.
There's a stop video, should be if you're on a computer on the bottom, right next to
Lower
the
left.
mute.
Yeah,
On the left.
And
Just
if it's
not
running,
everybody can do that. I've
Lower left.
discovered.
well, let me just finish. So I was getting requests to say, stop the videos because they thought there was some thought that it was interfering with her video because we had so many people on. So I decided to do it. I just, because I can stop people's videos. But unfortunately, I can't start them.
Yeah.
I just have to ask you to start them and then you're allowed to start them.
I
But
thought-
I thought given, and it made quite a difference actually. Once I did that, her video synced up with her audio much better. So,
Yes.
so that's the decision. And then in a couple breakout rooms, I was able to help people get their videos back. But,
How many
Yeah.
breakout rooms did you have? I mean, I like the idea where you have only like 5 or 6 in a breakout room as
Yeah,
opposed
that's
to like 20.
yeah, I calculated breakout rooms so there'd be like 6 people per room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
we could have used your help. We had somebody that could not get the video back.
I couldn't
Well,
get.
we
my-
had 4 and none of us had video.
I
Okay.
couldn't get
So-
my video back.
So the other thing is to, that's why we said, click the question mark, which another breakout room did. I
Yes.
joined their breakout room and then I was able to get their video back for
My
them.
suggestion is if you make an announcement at the beginning of the meeting that at some point you're going to have breakout, you're going to have to turn off. It's not then, and then everybody just doesn't listen, and just a lot of people just kind of turned off at that point and then turned on. I don't know what happened.
Well, we tried. All right, let's wrap things up.
Yeah.
Anyway, welcome back.
Yes, it was a good program, Nancy.
I think it was excellent. I think she was great. I hope you enjoyed your discussions. We think we could have gone on for a while in our breakout room. So thanks for participating. We appreciate your comments and suggestions for future speakers and welcome any thoughts you may have on ways to improve our online programs. We look forward to seeing you again on January 13th. On behalf of our Lunch and Learn Committee, Phyllis and I want to wish you a very happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, and please stay safe. We'll see you in January.
Okay.
Same to you.
Happy Hanukkah to you too.
Take care, everybody.
Nancy.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Be well, everyone.
Stay safe.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.